Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm delighted to be joined by Rivkah Brown. Coming up later tonight, we look at events in Georgia after protesters react to a controversial new law. And talking of controversy, new sex education guidance has been leaked. We'll speak to an expert about what it all means. Today is the 76th anniversary of the Nakba in Palestine. Now, Nakba is the Arabic word for catastrophe, and it's used to describe the events of 1948 when 750,000 Palestinians were driven from their homes by Zionist paramilitaries in an act of ethnic cleansing. They lost their possessions, their land, and their belongings, and saw the attempted destruction of their culture and identity. Thousands of Palestinians were killed in dozens of massacres, and over 500 villages were destroyed across the territory that would become the State of Israel. Now, Nakba Day falls on the 15th of May each year. That's the day after Israel's Independence Day, which marks the founding of that state. In the occupied West Bank, Nakba Day was signalled with sirens. And around the world, protests have taken place in solidarity with Palestinians, many of whom continue to live as refugees, unrecognized as nationals of any existing state. In 2013, there were 5 million Palestinian refugees living in Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, as well as in the West Bank and Gaza. Now, a common call amongst those protests is for the international community to uphold the Palestinians' right of return to the areas from which they were displaced. According to Palestinians, that right was enshrined by the UN in a resolution by the General Assembly in 1948, though Israel and its allies do not agree. There is some ambiguity in the resolution. In Gaza, the Nakba of 76 years ago is likely to be at the forefront of Palestinians' mind as they potentially endure a new Nakba of their own. The 2.3 million inhabitants of the enclave have now been bombed, displaced, and deprived of the essentials for life for over 7 months by Israel. In the last week, 500,000 people have been displaced from Rafah by IDF evacuation orders as tanks close in. They have moved to a so-called humanitarian zone on the coast, that's south of Gaza City, setting up makeshift accommodation on a narrow strip of sand. UN official Olga Cherevko is in Gaza. Here she explains the state of those fleeing Rafah.
They're running away with all of their belongings, so whatever they can pick up and they can gather, and whatever they have, which is already so minimal. And the conditions in which they were living and to which they're coming, to which they're arriving, are so terrible that it's difficult to put into words. To be honest, there is no sanitation where they're going. There's no water, no food. And of course, shelter supplies. And as you know, because of the crossings closure, we haven't been able to get a lot of supplies in. No supplies in, really. So this is becoming a huge concern.
Despite the killing of over 35,000 Palestinians in Gaza in just 7 months and the displacement of around 1.5 million people, the US has decided it will continue to fund and supply Israel's war effort. The Biden administration has confirmed that it will ask Congress for a further $1 billion for sales of arms to Israel. That comes just days after Biden promised to halt some shipments of arms to Israel if the IDF went ahead with a full invasion of Rafah. So taking away weapons with one hand, then giving them right back with the other. And the question of even more arms funding from the US came up when Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was interviewed by CNBC.
The US administration is pushing to release $1 billion of weapons aid to Israel. Can you confirm that? And do you have a sense of when that will happen?
Well, I hope it happens soon. Look, I appreciate the help we receive from the United States from the beginning of the war. President Biden came here. He sent also these battle carrier groups, and we got weapons. Yes, we do have a disagreement on Gaza, on Rafah. But we have to do what we have to do. And, sometimes you just have to do what is required to ensure your survival in your future. We cannot continue into the future by having Hamas retake Gaza. It's not only would be a tremendous victory for Hamas, It would be a tremendous victory for the Iran terror axis, because Iran is trying to envelop us with a noose of death, of which Hamas is one component. And that victory is a victory against Iran. It's a victory for the moderate Arab states who are not openly, but who understand that their future is involved also with our victory against Hamas. So we are doing what we have to do, and I hope we can see eye to eye with the United States. We're talking to them, but ultimately we do what we have to do to protect the life of our nation.
I mean, the move towards, I suppose, ethnically cleansing the Palestinians in Gaza is not going to be a help to the Arab states. It's completely destabilizing them, because the publics are, absolutely outraged by what their leaders are doing, which is sort of, to a large extent, going along with this. Rivkah, I want to go to you on this. Joe Biden seems to be marking Nakba Day with the promise of more arms to Israel.
Right. And I mean, this obviously is a continuation of the project that Israel has had since its founding. I think it's important when we look at what's happening now in Gaza, not to think that this is a second Nakba, although obviously many of the people who are in Gaza currently are there because they were displaced in the Nakba of 48, but as one continuous Nakba that has been executed against the people of Palestine since before the foundation of the State of Israel, in fact. It is notable, though, that you have people, people like Bezalel Smotrich in 2021, then a backbencher, saying that he thought that Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, should have finished the job and kicked out all of the Arabs. Now the finance minister, and effectively getting his wish. Israel has expelled more than 3 times as many, or almost 3 times as many, I should say, Palestinians since October, which is to say, or killed almost 3 times as many as it did since October, as it did during the Nakba. So this isn't just a second Nakba. This is an even greater Nakba. But yeah, as I say, I think it's important not to see these two events as stochastic or as kind of standalone, but rather as one kind of continuous sweep of history. The plan in 1948, Plan Dalet, the kind of final plan that the Israeli forces came to, was the clearance, was the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian territories. Now we see exactly the same thing happening. We have experts in military strategy saying that Israel has no political plan in the ceasefire negotiations. What that means is that Israel doesn't want to come to a settlement with the Palestinian leaders, with Hamas. It wants the entire territory. And we're seeing that through Israel's actions, not through its words. Francesca Albanese, the UN rapporteur, who many viewers of Novara Live will be very familiar with by this point, who's, thanks to her numerous viral media appearances, recently pointed out that Israel likes to kind of couch what it's doing in Gaza, now in Rafah, in the kind of language of humanitarian aid and international law, using terms such as safe zones and humanitarian corridors, in order to mask what is effectively a total war in which only one side can win, i.e. a genocide. Israel is moving the Gazan population into an area which it says is safe, but which has no working hospitals, no medical infrastructure, and which it is continuing to bomb. So, like the US, Israel is saying one thing and doing something quite different. And I think it's kind of interesting, really, when you compare that with what happened in 1948. I think now, because of the kind of let's say, hegemony or the kind of popularization of international legal frameworks, thanks to, the Second World War, Israel now can no longer be so upfront about what it's doing. It sort of has to say that it's providing aid to Gaza, that it's creating safe zones and corridors and so on. Whereas in 1948, and in the run-up to it, Israel was actually far more explicit about the project of colonization and of kind of ethnic cleansing and population displacement that it was attempting. When we talk now, when you see supporters of Israel talk now about, settler colonialism being a smear that's used to describe the project of the State of Israel, you only have to look at the statements made very openly and proudly by people like Theodore Herzl, by Jabotinsky, by Benjamin Netanyahu's own father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, who described the project of Israel as a colonial project, akin to the colonization of America. There's a fantastic essay that I really encourage everyone to read by Netanyahu's father, who is a historian of Jewish history, making a kind of analogy between Israel's colonization of Palestine and America's of the kind of North America, and describing Palestinians as akin to Native Americans. So I think it's really interesting. I think what's happened, the difference between the Nakba of 48 and the Nakba of 2023-24 is that Israel is much more coy and much more aware of the game that it has to play to pass off what is exactly the same project as something kind of noble, as an act of self-defense.
No, I suppose, what would you say to, because people might say, look, a lot has happened in the last 76 years. There have been many injustices which haven't been, corrected for. And, sometimes it's best just to move on. I suppose I'll put to you sort of my response to that, which is that the reason this is still relevant and the reason people still talk about it is because Israel is still doing it, right? I personally think that if, say in the 90s, Israel had allowed for a Palestinian state to exist, then, people might have said, well, it was still unjustifiable what happened in 1948, or, there was still an injustice done, but yeah, let's move on. But I think it's the fact that they are still ethnically displacing Palestinians, which means that the Nakba to so many people, or the 1948 Nakba to so many people, is still incredibly relevant. Are you I want to know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think there is definitely something to do with the continuity of that history, which is deeply uncomfortable to Israelis, which is why, in debates such as the one that you recently had with Hen Mazig on Piers Morgan's show, Hen often likes to kind of represent periods of Israeli history and Palestinian history as sort of standalone, as what happened after October the 7th is somehow being kind of completely divorced from all that came before it, when in fact it was obviously a retaliation against years of blockade, displacement, apartheid, land theft, outright sort of cold-blooded murder. When we talk about the Nakba, we're not just talking about the displacement of 750,000 Palestinians. We're talking about the killing in cold blood, shooting families in front of one another, at Deir Yassin, at, numerous Palestinian villages, Tantura, Lida, Al-Dawaima, the list goes on and on. We're not just talking about ethnic cleansing as some bloodless act. So yeah, I definitely think there's something to do with the kind of continuity of the Nakba, of the ongoing Nakba, as Palestinians like to call it. But nevertheless, I think even if the Palestinian Nakba was no longer ongoing, I think that Israel would still have a moral obligation to repatriate and to recompense Palestinians whose lands it has stolen. We talk about, there's a lot of whataboutery that goes on in debates around this, particularly towards people who inhabit centers of former empire or kind of, global powers such as the US. Well, why doesn't America give back land to Native Americans? Well, actually, America has been doing just that. In December, the US State Department finished a 10-year project of giving land back to Native American populations that it had dispossessed in the 1880s. We're talking about nearly 150 years ago. So when people say, what about America? Well, exactly. America is, I'm not suggesting that American kind of repossession and compensation of Native Americans has been complete or sufficient. Of course, I have no doubt that it's not at all, and that it's also largely a way of whitewashing America's own history. However, if you're going to make those kinds of comparisons, then sure, we are doing buyback schemes for Native Americans. So why not for Palestinians?
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I suppose, the Americans would say it's, well, not the Americans would say. The thing you can say about the Americans is quite easy for them to do that because, there aren't many Native Americans left because America already did the genocide. There are 5 million Native Americans, population of, is it 350 million, something like that, of the United States. These are recent scenes of unrest in Tbilisi, the capital city of Georgia. Protesters there have been attacked by riot police after protesting a new piece of legislation passed by the Georgian parliament yesterday. The Foreign Agents Bill, also called the Russia Bill by its opponents, is widely seen as an attempt to clamp down on independent media in Georgia. It will require non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, and media companies to register as organizations pursuing the interest of a foreign influence if they receive more than 20% of their funding from abroad. And the legislation has triggered weeks of backlash in the streets. For the past 2 months, protesters have gathered outside Georgia's parliament, with numbers growing into the tens of thousands as the final reading of the bill drew closer. But as lawmakers voted 84-30 to pass the bill on Tuesday, demonstrators used a makeshift battering ram and crowbars to smash through the barriers surrounding Parliament. Georgian riot police forced protesters back while others were taken away. In total, around 20 people were arrested. But the protesters refused to move away despite heavy-handed tactics by police and continued to occupy the central square throughout last night. There wasn't just violence in the streets, though. In Georgia's parliament, physical fights broke out between lawmakers as they prepared to vote for or against the bill. Protesters have called the legislation the Russia Bill because they believe that it is an attempt by the ruling Georgian Dream Party to return the country to Russia's sphere of influence, citing similar laws introduced by Russian President Vladimir Putin in 2012. And they distrust Bidzina Ivanishvili. He's the billionaire backer of Georgian Dream, who made his money by buying up Russian firms during the period of mass privatization following the fall of the Soviet Union. The protesters, largely young Georgians in their teens and early 20s, also fear the bill will block Georgia's entry into the EU. That's a process that has been formally underway since Georgia was awarded candidate status in December. And the EU have made their stance on the bill very clear, releasing this statement as the bill passed through Parliament. So they said, despite large protests and unequivocal calls by the international community, the Georgian government ruling majority adopted the law on transparency of foreign influence in Parliament in third reading. The EU has clearly and repeatedly stated that the spirit and content of the law are not in line with EU core norms and values. They say the adoption of this law negatively impacts Georgia's progress on the EU path. The choice on the way forward is in Georgia's hands. We urge the Georgian authorities to withdraw the law. The United States has also voiced its displeasure at the bill, with White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre saying this.
We're deeply troubled by Georgia's Kremlin-style foreign agents legislation, which just passed, as you just stated, Parliament, and we expect the president to veto it. While it is unclear whether Parliament will try to override a potential veto, we have been outspoken about our concerns with the legislation, which runs counter to democratic values and would move Georgia further away from the values of the European Union, and let's not forget also NATO. The Georgian people have been making their views known about this legislation, protesting in the streets, as you all have been reporting this weekend. We saw some of the largest protests in Georgia's history, with tens of thousands of peaceful protesters undeterred by intimidation tactics, telling their government to oppose this legislation because they want Euro-Atlantic future. We will see what the parliament does, but if this legislation passes, it will compel us to fundamentally reassess our relationship with Georgia.
So why are the West and Russia both so interested in Georgia? Well, it's a pretty small country. It's got a population of fewer than 4 million people. But like Ukraine, Georgia has a long border with Russia. And again, like Ukraine, the population of the former Soviet Republic has increasingly called for stronger ties with the West, including EU membership. It also has 2 breakaway regions seeking independence, Abkhazia in the northwest and South Ossetia in the north. Together, those 2 regions make up about 20% of Georgia's territory, and they are very much in Russia's sphere of influence. Some people, I'm sure, would describe them as Russian puppet regimes. They're recognized as independent states by Russia. There are some Russian troops stationed in the territories. Neither of them are recognized as independent by any Western government. Now, the scenes in Georgia are very much connected with the ongoing war in Ukraine, a point that Georgia's opposition leader, Tina Bokuchava, was asked about on Newsnight.
When you look at what's happening in your country, when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, is President Putin winning?
President Putin is not winning. He's not winning in Ukraine, and he's not winning in Georgia. And you can see this in the streets of Tbilisi, where thousands and thousands, and in fact hundreds of thousands of people, and the scale of the peaceful protest has been unprecedented in Georgia's recent history. Even the National Liberation Movement in the 80s, or even the Peaceful Rose Revolution of 2003, did not have the scale that we're seeing now, where hundreds of thousands of people are protesting the attempt by the Ivanishvili government to derail Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations. This is why Putin is not winning, because the Ukrainian people are standing up to him in Ukraine, and the Georgian people are standing up to Putin and the Putin-inspired Russian law that Bidzina Ivanishvili is trying to adopt here in Georgia in the streets of Tbilisi.
There are also echoes of recent history in Ukraine, with the scenes in Tbilisi reminiscent of those in Kyiv in 2013. The Euromaidan protests broke out that November when then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych chose to break ties with the EU and forge a stronger relationship with Moscow. Those protests saw similar violent scenes, but also the presence of Western dignitaries amongst the crowds, including US Assistant Secretary of State Victoria Nuland handing out sandwiches to protesters. There were no sandwiches in Tbilisi, but Western politicians turned up there too, including the Foreign Affairs Minister of the Foreign Affairs Ministers of EU members, Lithuania and the Czech Republic. The chair of Germany's Foreign Affairs Committee, Michael Roth, also suddenly appeared amongst the crowd where he gave this speech.
Tbilisi is the true capital of Europe, and we are all proud of you. Your fight is our fight. And you can expect more from us than just lip services. Today, one of the activists and one of the journalists was asking us, what should we tell the voters of Georgian nightmare? My message and my answer is very simple. Please, dear Georgians, voters of Georgian nightmare, listen to the young generation, listen to your kids, listen to your sisters and brothers.
Tbilisi is the new capital of Europe. They do kind of come out with some ridiculous things. These sort of politicians who really want to expand Europe and sort of get up to Russia's border. I don't have any strong opinions on this. I think if Georgians want to join the European Union, good for them. Also, I don't want to see another situation like we saw in Ukraine. In any case, to find out more about this situation, I spoke to someone who actually knew a bit about it earlier today. I spoke to Georgian academic Leila Rivkah, a researcher at Leibniz University. I began by asking her whether Georgia's foreign influence bill genuinely represents a move to align the country more closely with Russia and away from the European Union.
I would not frame it this way. I would not say it is a bid to move closer to Russia. As you know, locally, protesters have framed the bill as the Russian law quite often. It has its own reasons. I think protest movement, if we can call it so far a movement, has good case to articulate two things. One, there is a huge risk, and the law looks similar to the foreign agent law that Russia had passed more than a decade ago. It also looks like the foreign agent laws or variations of such laws that in the neighborhood in Central Asia, Kyrgyzstan has passed, Kazakhstan has considered to pass. So in this sense, even if it is not an attempt to geopolitically or in terms of foreign policy come close to Russia, it certainly is reminding of type of authoritarian regime that Russia has consolidated in more than a decade now, right? On the other hand, there is one more reason why Georgian protesters can frame this as the Russian law, right? That Georgian government in the past 2 years has been increasingly confrontational against the West and has questioned European integration path that really all the previous Georgian governments, and including the current government, have crafted for the last 3 decades. So in Georgian society, whether one likes it or not, there is a very high acceptance and very high support for European integration. And this is what the government has essentially openly undermined in the past 2 years. And the so-called foreign agent law, or as Georgian protesters would call it, Russian law, is seen as one of key steps in further undermining relationships with European Union and more broadly the West. So I don't know, I cannot evaluate this as a bid to come close to Russia, but certainly it is projecting on authoritarian consolidation that would be similar to Russia and other countries that are tightening authoritarian grip on respective societies. We know that it's not restricted to Eastern Europe, but also to the West and beyond, right? Beyond Europe, we see consolidation of authoritarian regimes. And secondly, this has been one of the key steps to undermine relationships with Europe.
And in terms of NGOs, so this law sort of targets NGOs or media organizations that have more than 20% of their funding from abroad. And I suppose the context here is that there are lots of NGOs in Georgia which are sort of funded, especially by sort of Western organizations. I mean, what's going on there? How should we understand the role of NGOs in Georgia?
So Georgia is a very dependent economy, and dependent civil society is one of the aspects of this dependent economy. What I would argue in general, there are sometimes leftists who come through and would say that NGOs are a problem of Georgian democracy. And while I do agree and I understand that some of the NGOs have played very supportive role of the establishment of the type of neoliberal peripheral capitalist economy that Georgia now is, I do think that the reduction of Georgia's problems to Western-funded NGOs is, to the least, just really a narrow way of seeing the challenge here, right? Georgian government has been collaborating with all sorts of powers to establish this type of economy. And when we talk of the West, it has been the Georgian government that has been the largest receiver and is being still largest receiver of the aid, largest receiver of loans and all sorts of financial investments, particularly actually in banking and finance and also in infrastructures. So this is a dependent economy, and certain NGOs also play a role. They are part of this economy. It is ironic, though, and unacceptable that this government then tells us that the NGOs should be controlled further, while the entire economy, including a lot of economy that they rely on, stands on the same type of dependencies. Now, besides that, we need to understand that besides the, say, powerful NGOs that the government targets, in Georgia, because there is very little other legal forms for associational life, essentially everything that happens here is NGOs. So you have thousands and thousands of NGOs that do various things, and many of them, I mean, the definition in this law is that more than 20%, if you're funded with more than 20% from abroad, you would be considered by this law. I don't know if you already have explained to your followers what this means. So people or organizations would need to sign up as carriers of interests of foreign powers. And that once they're registered this way, the government could pretty much, based on the complaint of anyone, enter these institutions and investigate whatever they want to investigate, including get access to private data of organization members, et cetera, et cetera. So it gives quite a lot of power to the state over the civil society organizations. So given that most of this large number of NGOs are dependent on foreign money, this means that not only a lot of people will be targeted, but full kind of space of also economic dependence will be undermined, right? So the government is really, in this sense, attacking thousands and thousands of people and their dependence in this sense, and collapsing this type of NGO economy that exists in Georgia while pursuing all sorts of other sectors of the dependent economy that they pursue. So they want to continue doing everything else without some kind of space of independence and some kind of space of still having associational life where people could at least voice discontent and mobilize for alternatives.
And finally, let's talk about sort of inevitable comparisons to Ukraine. I mean, in 2013 and 2014, we saw a movement of sort of Western-minded young protesters trying to, reverse a move by a somewhat Russian-friendly government towards Russia at the expense of the EU. Now, that protest movement was successful in the sense that it overthrew the government, right, and it sort of cancelled that deal with the Russians. At the same time, that then sort of was the origin story of the situation we're in now, whereby Russia occupied part of the land and then they ended up invading the country. Is there sort of fear that Georgia could now be sort of inevitably on a similar trajectory?
Yes. And this fear is very much also populated by the government, who during the past 2 years has really portrayed itself as a political power that ensures peace in Georgia in contrast to Ukraine. Georgian government has also portrayed the opposition as the kind of parties that would most likely lead to the war in Georgia. Now, the challenge here, honestly, is that many from such parties have voiced very, very problematic discourses or attitudes that essentially fed into the government's narrative, right? And lately, Georgian government is talking of the war party in very conspiracy language, which is that they're ultimately behind the war party discourse, talking of the US. So they take all this semi-transparent discourses to say that they can protect Georgia from the war, while the US and the opposition would drag Georgia into the war. Now, I must say, this is very hard for me to comment on this because obviously there are risks, geopolitical risks in Georgia that resonate also with the population, that also make the government's discourse quite understandable for many that do not want to be drawn into any war or conflict right now. And they especially do not want to have political power in the government that would actively risk such a conflict. On the other hand, whether I see there is a risk of this happening is a difficult question. And I think I need to come back to the character of protests, because in Georgian context currently, the opposition parties are not yet powerful. So Georgian protest, this is really more than a month and a half mobilization of population within Tbilisi and coming from the regions on daily basis, thousands, tens of thousands sometimes. People mobilize on streets very regularly, very peacefully. This is outstanding how well people manage to keep peace on streets despite increasing pressure and repressions from the government side. But from all I know, what I have witnessed and what I have heard my comrades discuss, And what one can really see on TV is that despite the fact that some of the protest mobilizers at points give voice to opposition parties, crowds at demonstrations are not marching under the opposition parties. This also makes the situation very tough because this government, which I think is very problematic, does not have challengers. But the challengers that it has are, at least from my political standpoint, themselves very discredited, and for good reasons discredited political forces. And the protests in Tbilisi are not going to take, from all we know now, are not going to take their leadership as a way out of ongoing crisis. This is what allows me to think very carefully, because we cannot predict what will happen. In Georgia's particular context, I do not think that we will see a revolutionary change of government in favor of current discredited opposition. That might have risked escalation of relations with Russia.
That was Georgian academic Leila Rekviashvili speaking to me earlier today. Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, was shot today in what appears to be an assassination attempt. According to witnesses, 3 or 4 shots rang out as the Prime Minister was leaving a government meeting. He was hit in the stomach, arm and leg before his security detail moved him to his official car. Fico was airlifted to hospital and his condition is being described as life-threatening. Now, a 71-year-old Slovakian man has been arrested. He's from a village in the centre of the country. The pistol used was reportedly legally held. No motive has yet been ascertained. I imagine this is a story we might be coming back to later in the week. Seems very significant.
Children who need to be able to count and multiply are learning anti-racist mathematics, whatever that may be. Children who need to be able to express themselves in clear English are being taught political slogans. Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay.
That was Margaret Thatcher in 1987 announcing the introduction of Section 28, which banned, quote, the promotion of homosexuality by schools in Britain. Now, Section 28 was in place until 2003 and had an enormously damaging effect on gay kids for the 15 years it was in force. And lots of people would say actually it had a legacy beyond that. There are now concerns that our current Tory government is about to do something similar. The front page headline on today's Times says, "Don't teach pupils about gender ID, schools told." And that story is based on a briefing from government sources about a review into the teaching of sex and relationship education, which is set to be published this Thursday. As for its contents, the Times writes this: Ministers will warn schools on Thursday that gender identity is a highly contested area and that teaching children about it could have damaging implications. Staff will be explicitly told to avoid proactively teaching children about gender identity. If asked, they should teach, quote, biological facts about sex. Now, I have to say, in this particular area, I really don't envy teachers. We are currently in a period where our understanding of trans identities and what's best for kids doesn't seem sort of in any way obvious, right? It's of course also difficult to discuss biological facts about sex when we have a very poor understanding of the biological basis of trans identities. But it also seems fair to assume that this is not just a move by the government to bring some clarity to an area where facts are contested. This is, after all, a Prime Minister who teased Keir Starmer for supposedly not knowing what a woman is when the mother of a murdered trans teenager was present. And it's not just teaching about gender identity that the Tories have their sights on. So the Times reports this. The guidance will also impose age limits on sex education for the first time to address concerns that children are being exposed to sensitive material before they are ready. It will state that children should not be given any form of sex education in primary school until year 5, when aged 9 and over. Information should be limited at that stage to the basic facts of conception and birth, with what they need to know to stay safe, including appropriate boundaries and how to report concerns. Explicit discussions of sexual acts should not take place until year 9, when children are aged 13 and over. This includes conversations about contraception, sexually transmitted infections, and abortion. Domestic violence, coercive control, and sexual violence should also not be discussed until children are 13. Detailed conversations about pornography and how it can lead to children having a distorted view of themselves should be delayed until year 9. Now, that is really, really worrying, right? You've got kids who are, they're seeing explicit material on their phones from potentially, younger than 10, I don't know. And then they're not going to be taught about the effects of porn until they're 13. Seems to me to be completely wrong-headed. I wanted to speak to someone with a bit more sort of expertise on these issues, though. So earlier today, I spoke to Jo Morgan. She's founder and CEO of Engendering Change. Jo has 15 years of experience in teaching and gained national attention for her work on relationships and sex education, LGBTQ inclusion and well-being. I started by asking her what she made of the leaked guidance.
They are so poorly put together from what we have seen. They completely fly in the face of what all of the experts are saying, what the evidence indicates we should be doing. And it's just so clearly an attempt to kind of stoke moral hysteria, I would say.
What you're saying sort of about it conflicting with evidence, what sort of evidence are you talking about there? What is understood to be best practice when it comes to sex and relationship education?
Yeah, so there's a really useful report which has been done by the Sex Ed Forum called The Evidence. And it makes it really clear that when young people receive relationships and sex education, the outcomes are positive across the board. Rather than sexualize them, it means that when they do have sex, they tend to delay it. It tends to be safer. They tend to embrace gender equity more in their attitudes towards each other. They're better at communicating consent and reporting issues if they happen. From every kind of angle, really, it works. It helps them to be able to deal with the world of sex and relationships and make healthy, positive decisions which are right for them.
Well, the headlines in terms of the leaked report, as you say, sort of we'll have to see the details, are about sort of age restrictions. So the claim being made is that no child below the age of 9 should get sex education. Now, to me, that's somewhat ambiguous if that also refers to relationship education. I certainly think that kids below the age of 9 should be told that, parents might be of the same sex or they might be of different sexes, for example. But I suppose, could you give our audience a bit of an introduction to how it works when it comes to what children are taught at what age? And how these decisions are made as it currently stands?
Yeah, so in 2020, relationships and sex education was made statutory. In the primary sector, that's relationships education and health education. And then you have the science curriculum on top of that, so teaching things like reproduction. And then in secondary schools, they bring in the relationships, sex and health education. So it's only a recent development. And when the government announced that they were going to be a review into the statutory guidance, of course, as an expert in the field, I welcome that. I was concerned, however, that it was going to be guided by a sort of political agenda rather than really grounded in the evidence and what's actually going on. And we've been seeing over the past few months, even longer actually, sort of rumblings from Conservative MPs talking about things like sex education, teaching young people how to choke each other safely, 72 genders being taught, and this sort of moral hysteria around children being sexualized, when actually the curriculum is, I would say, pretty straightforward, not controversial. It went through a huge review with many different groups, including religious bodies and so on. And actually what's being taught to young children in primary schools is mainly about friendships, families, boundaries, how to keep yourself safe online, and so on. So this idea that they're going to ban sex education for under 9s, I would question what sex education they're actually talking about. It's a really nebulous thing anyway, and something which the guidance doesn't clarify. Which topics would fit under health education, sex education, relationships education? If you're going to do a Venn diagram, there's going to be a huge amount of crossover between them. So what is it that they've seen that's happening that they now want to ban? I would argue probably nothing.
You've said sort of that the curriculum as it stands is uncontroversial. And I suppose, to me, it seems as if there might be some areas which are inevitably controversial, or at least, let's say, sort of difficult. Because when it comes to trans issues and sort of how best to treat a child with gender dysphoria, or when someone might be experiencing gender dysphoria or just uncomfortability with puberty, there seems to be lots of issues that we as a society, or even sort of healthcare professionals, haven't really come to any consensus on. And when it comes to an issue like that, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with questions such as gender identity, which I think are inevitably contentious because, as sort of the Cass review sort of suggested, the evidence at the moment isn't very good. How do you approach that?
I think for me, what should be woven through all of these lessons is character education. So young people are being empowered throughout the course to work out who they are, what their values are, what they believe in, what relationships they want, how they want to contribute to society, their political views, and so on. And so from my perspective, it's about giving them different stimuli and what do you think? If it is a contentious issue, that you look at the debate around it. If it's something that they're likely being exposed to online and seeing a very polarized debate in the case of trans rights, what are we going to do? Put our fingers in our ears and pretend it's not happening and refuse to talk about it? Or are we going to dive in and say, right, what's going on? What do you think? How does it relate to the Equality Act? And so on.
One of the things that's sort of been briefed, I don't know how this would appear in any sort of actual document given to schools, but they keep saying whenever gender is taught, it has to be rooted in sort of a scientific understanding of biology. Is there sort of an understanding of biology sort of interwoven in the courses you give? Or I suppose your answer about character building there suggests that maybe that's somewhat irrelevant. I mean, what do you make of that particular sort of talking point that they're pushing at the moment?
I think it's really interesting. I think we can only speculate that when they're talking about, from what we've seen leaked today, when they're talking about sex, biology, and focusing on that they actually have a very narrow idea of what they mean in that regard. So if we were talking about biological sex, I would also be wanting to talk about intersex people. I would guess, however, that that's not actually going to be on the guidance that they're going to be publishing if they do. I would want to be looking at gender dysphoria as a potential neurological condition if we're talking about biological sex. And then I would also want to be looking at arguments that gender is something different to that. For many people, gender has both an internal aspect in terms of gender identity, may indeed be biological, and then an external aspect in terms of your, what you're showing to the world and how you perform gender and the pronouns that you use and so on. So to me, it seems as though there is a real agenda here, which is very narrow, and one which is going to leave teachers feeling really concerned and confused about what they can say and what they can't say. I think a much better approach would be to acknowledge that this is, or has been made to be, a big issue of our time. Young people are going to be talking about this, be interested in it, be exposed to a lot of information online. And actually our job as educators is to educate and to help them to build their own sense of self and critical thinking skills and intellectual curiosity.
The way this has been briefed is very negative. And I mean that in the sense of you aren't allowed to do this, you aren't allowed to do that. Teachers shouldn't be doing this, teachers shouldn't be doing that. It seems to be based, I mean, as you seem to be describing it, and I think there's a lot of truth to this, on a bit of a sort of moral panic that teachers are trying to sort of indoctrinate students. Looking at this in a more positive sense, and I suppose we might expect these to not be in the government's review, perhaps we'll be surprised. But what do you think teachers should be doing that perhaps they're not currently doing when it comes to sort of what should we be telling kids And obviously there have been absolutely dramatic changes in very recent years. So since when I went to school, but even sort of since someone went to school perhaps 10 years ago or 5 years ago, in terms of TikTok and social media. What are we missing? Lots of people are very worried about sort of how kids are growing up. Sort of you get these talking points such as Andrew Tate. How do we make sure that kids sort of grow up with a healthy understanding of sex and relationships, and what more could schools be doing that they're currently not doing?
Well, it's very much the focus of my new book, Empowering Relationships and Sex Education, which comes out next month. And the entire book is really about the joys of relationships and sex education, and how when we get it right, it can be the greatest gift that we can possibly give to young people. I don't know about you, but there's so much that I learned at school that I have never used since. But relationships and sex, and actually our own sense of self around those things, are huge. And when we get them right, it can make us feel so happy and so connected with other people and give us pleasure and so much more. But when we get it wrong, it can really cause quite fundamental damage to our sense of self and our ability to connect with others. And so I would regard the current statutory relationships and sex education not as the kind of maximum that we can do, which is how a lot of schools see it. Rather, I would argue it's the minimum that we should do. And there is so much more to be said. Young people are interested in this topic. They want to talk. They need us to give them a safe space with reliable information where they can unpack things like aspirational misogyny and pornography and whatever it is that is going on in their lives. You know, it's not good enough to just pretend it isn't happening and refuse to talk to them about it. We cover all kinds of things in schools. It's not just about indoctrinating children into a particular perspective. It's about helping them to become adults and find their way through life.
Paul Mason has announced he is standing for selection to be the Labour candidate in Islington North. Yes, you remembered that correctly. It's Jeremy Corbyn's parliamentary seat. To announce the move, Paul Mason sort of tweeted quite a long essay on his Twitter account. I'll read you a sort of the start of it. I will be applying for selection as Labour's candidate in Islington North. The scale of poverty in the borough, together with the acute crisis for private renters and the threats to local health services, means Islington needs to be setting Labour's agenda in power. I worked hard for Jeremy Corbyn while leader, and I hope to build on the decades of tireless work he's done for local people. I backed Keir Starmer and took part in his leadership campaign in 2020 because I knew he could put us where we are today, on the brink of a Labour government that will give Britain its future back. And he says, throughout the selection process, I'll do my best to keep the Labour and trade union movement in Islington united around our common goals, delivering Keir Starmer's 5 missions, enacting Labour's New Deal for working people, and achieving a new comprehensive partnership with Europe to reverse the most damaging effects of Brexit. Now, of course, in case you didn't know who Paul Mason was, he was a BBC journalist at Newsnight, then Channel 4. He's been on Novara Media a number of times, so we don't seem to get on so well anymore since he tried to dob us into MI5. He has tried to be an MP, I think, in 4 seats before, so Sheffield Central, a seat in Greater Manchester, a seat in Wales. He had previously sort of tried to be an MP in cities and Westminster. But now, the lucky people of Islington North, they might get a chance to select Paul Mason to be MP, and then he'll be standing against Jeremy Corbyn, who I think has confirmed he will be standing as an independent. Rivkah, what's going on here? What's he thinking?
Oh, man. One can only speculate what is going on inside Paul Mason's head. I actually hope he does get the nomination because I think it will be hilarious. Like, can you imagine a man who's had as many sort of like political convictions as Sarah Jessica Parker in Sex and the City, like taking on a man who's had the same political principles since the 1970s? Like, it would just be insane. I think it's a very sad day. I think we have to remember, as Ash pointed out on Twitter, for the people of Mid and South Pembrokeshire who are very enchanted, I'm sure, by Paul's overtures about how much he loved Pembrokeshire. And he did live in London, but he did spend at least 3 months a year in Mid and South Pembrokeshire, and he looked forward to spending more time there in the future. Paul Mason is the epitome of the Starmer project, someone who is totally willing to throw out any sort of statement in order to gain power and to shapeshift every which way if it means a chance at the throne, and who will embarrass himself to absolutely high heaven in order to get there. And I think that's just good telly, isn't it? That's just going to be like quite amusing for the next few months. So my honest hope for Paul Mason is that he doesn't fall at the first hurdle, but that we are given at least some silver lining over the next few months of general election campaigning in the comedy of errors that will be Paul Mason's North Islington candidacy.
Well, if you're watching Paul Mason, maybe get in touch with Rivkah, because it sounds like she might phone bank for you to get this selection, only because she wants to see what happens next. Rivkah, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Apologies we didn't go to you sort of as much as we usually would. It's because we had those two sort of separate interviews on quite technical subjects. But the next time you're on, let's make sure we normally have some quite big debates when we're on together, don't we?
Yeah, I know. And I was looking forward to discussing the ins and outs of police overreach today with you. But Paul Mason, I agree, was the much bigger story.
And it means we've ended it all so amicably. Harmony in the studio today. Thank you, everyone, for watching this evening. Come back tomorrow for another stream. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.